Diego Ávila wasn't just a name, it was a promise, a roar of hope that echoed from the dusty alleys of his small town in Mexico to the sacred fields of the capital. His journey was forged in discipline and sacrifice, a path walked with a ball at his feet and the weight of an entire future on his back. For his family and his community, Diego was living proof that it was possible to dream, that talent and grit could break the chains of poverty. He became more than a soccer player. He was a beacon, a symbol that glory was attainable. It was a story that inspired everyone, and that's why I need your help to keep telling accounts like Diego's. I want to ask you, from the bottom of my heart, to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Please also comment what city you're watching from, because your support gives me the fuel to continue. On the field, Diego was a maestro. His vision of the game was legendary, a tactical intelligence that seemed to predict every opponent's move, every opportunity, every weakness. He wasn't just brute force, he was a strategist, a leader who commanded the team with a mix of calm and overwhelming intensity. Known as El Capitan, he didn't just play, he dictated the pace of the match, transforming chaos into a symphony of precise passes and devastating attacks. His teammates followed him without hesitation, trusting his instinct, his ability to find victory where others only saw failure. This same calculating mind, which designed brilliant plays on the grass, held a complexity that few knew, a double-edged sword that fate would sharpen in a terribly perverse way. Away from the spotlight, the hero gave way to a man of few words and simple gestures. His fortress was Isabella, the girlfriend who had known him since his dreams were bigger than his soccer cleats. A physical therapist, she was his safe harbor, the only one who saw the cracks in his armor of an invincible athlete. At his side was also Chico, his best friend on the team, the personification of loyalty and conscience who kept him grounded. These bonds were Diego's anchor, a constant reminder of his origins and the values he swore never to abandon. He was the dedicated son, the loyal friend, the passionate boyfriend, an identity built on love and honor, which contrasted brutally with the persona he would be forced to create in the shadows. The night of that match was electric. The stadium pulsed like a giant heart, and every fan chanted, "Diego, Ávila's name." It was the decisive game, the championship final, and the national team scouts were in the stands. This was his chance, the gateway to immortality in the sport he loved so much. The pressure was crushing, but Diego fed on it. For him, fear was just another opponent to be dribbled past. He tied his cleats in the locker room, the muffled roar of the crowd invading the space. And in his mind, he replayed not just the game's tactics, but the image of his father, the man who sacrificed everything for him to be there. Victory wasn't an option, it was an obligation, a debt of honor. Moments before stepping onto the field, he allowed himself a brief escape to the past. He remembered his father selling the family car to buy his first quality cleats, the long bus rides to practice, the pride in his tired eyes with every small victory. The Ávila family never had much, and an old debt taken on in a moment of desperation hung over them like a dark cloud. Diego knew that the $1 million contract that would come with a call-up to the national team wasn't just the realization of his dream, but the salvation of his family. He would play for them. Every drop of sweat, every sprint, every tackle would be an installment of that debt being paid, a promise of a future free from the anguish that had marked his childhood. The first whistle blew, and Diego's world was reduced to the 4 lines of the field. He was sublime. He floated across the grass, each touch of the ball, a stroke of genius. The crowd was ecstatic, witnessing the performance of a master at his peak. He disarmed, created, advanced. He was the personification of glory, the hero in his final act of consecration. The opponents seemed like mere supporting actors in his gala night. He was untouchable, a soccer god sculpted from grit and talent, living the climax of the life he had always dreamed of. Glory was palpable, the smell of victory was in the air, and the future seemed a bright, infinite horizon, waiting to be conquered by this young man destined to be a legend. However, in a luxury box, far from the raw passion of the stands, Ricardo Vargas watched the spectacle with a glacial smile. To him, Diego was not a hero. He was a piece on a much more complex and dirty board. Vargas, with his philanthropist facade and lone shark soul, saw Diego's talent not as a gift, but as collateral, an asset tied to a debt that Diego's father could never repay. He wasn't watching the game, but the appreciation of his investment, coldly calculating the exact moment to call in his bet. Vargas's presence in that box was a silent premonition, the shadow of a predator moving unseen, preparing the pounce that would change everyone's destiny forever. In the 42nd minute of the second half, the apex, with a bewildering dribble, Diego left two defenders behind and, facing the goal, shot with the force of all his dreams. The ball bulged the back of the net. The stadium exploded. Amid the chaos of the celebration, he ran to the sideline, kissed the team crest, and pointed to his parents in the stands. His teary eyes met his father's, and in that instant, a lifetime of struggles and sacrifices was rewarded. It was a moment of communion, of pure love and absolute triumph. Little did he know that this image, the last of his innocence, would be frozen in time as the portrait of a paradise lost, the last breath of a man before his soul was brutally torn from his body. The clock was in stoppage, time when the fatal play occurred. It wasn't a move of genius, but an act of pure brutality disguised as a challenge for the ball. An opposing defender, with a history of violence, came at him like a runaway train. Diego shielded the ball as he had thousands of times, but the impact was different. The slow motion of the tragedy captured the dry, nauseating sound of the bone snapping, a crack that pierced the roar of the stadium and silenced the world. Diego's scream was not that of an athlete. It was of a soul being torn apart. He fell, his body twisted unnaturally, and as the incandescent pain shot up his leg, his eyes saw the impassive face of his aggressor, who merely received a yellow card before walking away. On that ground, Diego felt not just the fracture, but the shattering of his faith in fair play. The world became a blur of distorted lights and sounds. The green of the grass, the white of the medical uniforms, the red of despair on his teammates' faces. Chico was by his side, tears streaming uncontrollably, while Isabella, who had stormed the field, held his hand, her voice a mix of pleading and technical knowledge, already understanding the severity of the situation. Diego was an island of agony, surrounded by an ocean of chaos. The physical pain was excruciating, but nothing compared to the existential pain that began to bloom in his chest. The realization that his identity was slipping away, along with the blood and strength from his leg. The hero was being carried out of his arena, not on the shoulders of glory, but on a stretcher that looked like a coffin, sealing the end of his era. In the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and the cold, impersonal light only intensified the sense of loss. The doctor's diagnosis was delivered with a surgical precision that cut deeper than any scalpel. Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, multiple torn ligaments, irreversible damage. The words, career ending, echoed in the sterility of the room, ricocheting off the walls and Diego's heart, shattering what was left of his spirit. He looked at his immobilized leg, a monument to his ruin, and felt an emptiness so profound it threatened to consume him. Everything he had fought for, the identity he had built, the future he had planned, had all turned to dust in a single second of calculated violence. He was no longer Diego Ávila, the player. He was just a broken man. The truth came like a poison, administered by the trembling hands of his own father. Consumed by guilt, the old man confessed the origin of the debt to Ricardo Vargas. a loan taken to save the small family store years ago. The injury hadn't been an accident. It was a message, a brutal reminder to let them know that Vargas hadn't forgotten the debt and that the deadline for payment had expired. The revelation transformed Diego's grief into something darker and more potent. His mourning gave way to a cold, cutting fury. The tragedy was no longer a stroke of bad luck, but an act of war. The enemy, once an abstract shadow, now had a name, a face, and a philanthropic smile that hid the cruelty of a monster. Staring at the white ceiling of the hospital room, Diego felt the change happen within him. Sadness crystallized into purpose. Helplessness fermented into a thirst for power. He knew that the justice of men was a farce, a theater where the rich like Vargas always bought the final act. If the world played dirty, he would learn the rules. There, in that bed of pain, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Vengeance was no longer a desire. It was the only thing he had left. He didn't care about the price, for he had already lost everything that mattered. This was the moment Diego Ávila, the hero, died, and from his ashes a dark promise was born. He wouldn't just defeat Ricardo Vargas, he would become the owner of the game and make the man who destroyed his life kneel before him. The hospital discharge brought no relief, only the confirmation of a new and distorted reality. Limping and leaning on a cane that had become a scepter of his dethronement, Diego Ávila left behind the world he knew. His first stop was in the forgotten neighborhood where a distant cousin lived, a man whose hands were dirty with the petty crimes the big city swallowed. Using what was left of his former prestige, the name that still opened doors, Diego didn't ask for help, but for an entry. He didn't want charity. He wanted to learn the rules of the game that unfolded in the shadows, the only field where he felt he could still compete. His charisma, once used to charm the press, would now be his weapon to navigate the murky waters of the underworld. The contrast was brutal and immediate. The smell of cut grass was replaced by the stench of mold and gunpowder. The applause of the crowd gave way to paranoid whispers in dimly lit alleys. There, respect wasn't earned with talent, but with the cold demonstration of violence. Diego, in his designer clothes that now seemed like a costume, was a stranger in a strange land. He felt the gazes of distrust and contempt, but inside, the fire of revenge burned away any trace of fear. He watched, he learned, he absorbed every detail of this new predatory ecology. His determination was a steel mask that hid the scared young man still living in some forgotten corner of his soul, a weakness he knew he had to exterminate to survive. It didn't take long for his strategic mind, once dedicated to breaking through defenses, on the field to find a new purpose. He watched his cousin's operation and saw only inefficiency and amateurism. Poorly planned routes, predictable schedules, a lack of discipline that bordered on suicidal. With the precision of a coach drawing a play on a clipboard, Diego began to suggest changes. He optimized the trafficking logistics, applied concepts of time and space to avoid police patrols, and created a coded communication system. His ideas, initially met with skepticism, soon proved to be brilliant, increasing profits and reducing risks. He wasn't just another guy, he was a visionary in a world of brutes. It was in this setting that he met El Silencio, a sicario with empty eyes and few words, whose loyalty was as lethal as the knife he carried. Unlike the others, who saw Diego as a crippled ex-athlete trying to play criminal, El Silencio saw something more. He saw the same calculating coldness that inhabited himself, the predatory intelligence that separated leaders from mere soldiers. They didn't need many words. A nod of the head, a look of mutual recognition. A silent pact was sealed between Diego's strategic mind and the lethal force of his new acquaintance. Together, they formed a cohesive and terrifying unit, the brains and the blade of a new organization being born from the ashes. The first major test came quickly. During a routine delivery, the crew was ambushed by rivals in a dead-end alley. Panic set in, shots echoed, and his cousin's men ran. aimlessly, ready to abandon the cargo and save their own skins. That's when Diego took command. With a frightening calm, he shouted orders, using his knowledge of the terrain he had studied beforehand. He transformed chaos into a tactical maneuver, creating a diversion, flanking the enemies, and securing an escape route. They not only escaped, but they did so with the merchandise intact. That night, he ceased to be the famous cripple and became, for those men, a leader to be followed. As his reputation grew in the underworld, his personal life crumbled. Isabella watched Diego's transformation with a broken heart. The man she loved, the kind young man with an easy smile, was being replaced by a dark and distant figure whose eyes carried a weight she could no longer reach. The scars on his leg were visible, but the ones forming in his soul were much deeper. She tried, with all the love she still felt, to pull him back into the light, reminding him of his dreams and who he was. But Diego's obsession with Ricardo Vargas was an abyss opening between them, a black hole that swallowed all light and hope. The line he swore he would never cross finally appeared at his feet. An informant threatening the operation's security was captured. The sentence was death, and the task of carrying it out fell to Diego as the final proof of his ascension. With the gun in his hand, he faced the man's terrified face. His hands trembled. The player who cried when he scored a goal for his family now had to take a life. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. In that moment, he felt a part of himself die, along with the man on the floor. There was no hesitation, just a cold emptiness. He had crossed the border, and he knew there was no going back. News of his deeds reached Chico, who sought him out in a last, desperate appeal to their friendship. He found him not on a soccer field, but in a dark warehouse that reeked of chemicals and fear. "Look at you, Diego. This isn't revenge. It's suicide," he pleaded, his eyes full of the disappointment of someone watching an idol become a monster. Diego's response was devoid of emotion. He spoke of power, of respect, of a new kind of game with different rules. To Chico, it was like talking to a stranger. The chasm between them was now impassable, and he left knowing he had lost his best friend to the shadows he himself had chosen to embrace. The name El Capitan began to be whispered, with a mixture of mockery and fear. What was once a cruel irony about his lost career now became a title of power. Diego's operation, disciplined and efficient like an elite soccer team, began to dominate the territory. He didn't lead through brute fear, but through the intelligence and loyalty he inspired in his men. He was the captain of a different team now, one that played for life and death in the city's bloody streets, and his fame began to bother the old powers that be who did not tolerate the rise of an outsider. The first to feel threatened was Alejandro El Martillo Jimenez, a brutal old-school faction leader who saw El Capitan as an insult to his way of operating. For El Martillo, power was measured in spilled blood. He didn't understand Diego's strategy, his discretion, his efficiency. He saw him as weak. To send his message, El Martillo ordered a savage and public attack on one of Diego's distribution points, leaving a trail of bodies and a declaration of war. Spray-painted on the wall, the message was clear: this territory had an owner, and any intruder would be crushed without mercy. The war for control of the city had officially begun. Diego's response, however, did not come in the form of a retaliatory shootout, as everyone expected. He knew that a direct confrontation against El Martillo's brute force would be a bloodbath, with losses on both sides. Instead, he did what he always did best. He studied his opponent. For weeks, he gathered intelligence, mapped El Martillo's operations, identified his most important lieutenants, and, crucially, discovered his greatest weakness: his total dependence on a single supply route. With surgical precision, Diego attacked his enemy's logistics, cutting off his cash flow and sowing distrust among his men, all without firing a single direct shot. Diego's organization solidified. He recruited ex-military members to train his men, establishing a rigid discipline. El Silencio became his general, the executor of his most difficult orders. Diego created a structure where loyalty was rewarded with power and betrayal was punished with oblivion. Each member had a role, a position on the field, and he, as El Capitan, was the coach who saw the game from above, moving the pieces with terrifying genius. He was building more than a gang. He was erecting an empire on the pillars of strategy and efficiency, a criminal business model the underworld had never seen. Isabella made her last attempt. She found him in his new luxury apartment, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city he now wanted to conquer. The place was opulent but cold and lifeless, just like the man before her. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply placed an old photo of them on the marble table, smiling on a beach day when the future was a promise of happiness. "I still love the man in this picture," she said, her voice firm despite the pain. "But I don't recognize what you've become. It's him, or this life. You have to choose, Diego." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and final, the last chance for redemption. For a long moment, Diego just stared at the photograph. A flash of memory, the warmth of the sun, the sound of Isabella's laughter. It was a life that seemed to belong to someone else. He felt a pang of pain, an echo of who he once was. But then, he raised his eyes and looked through the panoramic window at the city lights spreading out at his feet. That was power. That was control. That was real. Vengeance was the only thing that moved him. In a voice that was no longer his, he replied, "That man is dead." Isabella didn't shed a tear. She just nodded, took the photo, and left, closing the door on the past. In that silence, Diego knew he had become a complete monster. Freed from his last moral anchor, El Capitan expanded his territory with relentless ferocity. Without Isabella's voice to haunt his conscience, his actions became bolder and more brutal. He absorbed what was left of El Martillo's empire, offering his men a simple choice, loyalty or the grave. His intelligence remained his greatest weapon, but now he didn't hesitate to use the rawest violence to assert his dominance. He became a whispered legend in the streets, a ghost who controlled the city from the shadows, the new king of a kingdom built on fear, blood, and the ashes of his former self. The meteoric rise of a new force in organized crime caught the attention of an adversary. Diego couldn't simply outflank or intimidate the federal police, and in particular Detective Morales, a stubborn and incorruptible man, a rarity in that system. Morales didn't see El Capitan as just another trafficker. He saw a pattern, an intelligence and a methodology that set him apart. Intrigued and alarmed, the detective began to piece together the puzzle, hunting for the identity of the mysterious leader who was rewriting the city's crime map, getting dangerously close to the past of a certain soccer player. Through his informants, Diego finally discovered the missing piece in his puzzle of revenge. Ricardo Vargas wasn't just a powerful loan shark, he was a key financial operator for the Sinaloa cartel, laundering money through his front businesses, including the world of soccer. The revelation was a gut punch. His enemy wasn't one man, but a hydra with 1,000 heads, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. To get to Vargas, he would have to take down a giant. His personal quest for revenge had just turned into an all-out war against the most feared cartel in Mexico. In the solitude of his penthouse, surrounded by a luxury that brought him no joy, Diego found himself watching a replay of his last game. He saw on the screen the young man full of life, running with a passion he could barely remember feeling. For an instant, the pain of loss, not of his leg, but of his soul, hit him hard. Who was that stranger on the screen? Who was the man? Staring back at him from the TV's dark reflection, he crushed the whiskey glass in his hand, the shards of glass cutting his skin. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emptiness that consumed him. He was no longer that player. He was El Capitan, and El Capitan had no weaknesses. The war against Sinaloa seemed impossible, a battle of David against a Goliath armed to the teeth. But Diego knew he couldn't back down. To shake the empire and expose Vargas, he needed to pull off a feat no one had ever dared. His tactical mind worked for days, and then the plan emerged, audacious and suicidal. He wasn't just going to hit a Sinaloa operation, he was going to steal the crown jewel, the monthly shipment of cash that left the city in an armored convoy, the collections from the entire territory. It was an act that would shout his name across the country, a declaration that a new power had risen. At this moment, he decided that to kill the king, he first needed to take his castle and show everyone that he was the new owner of the game. The planning of the operation was his masterpiece. He gathered his trusted team, with El Silencio by his side, and detailed the plan in an abandoned warehouse, using models and stopwatches, as if preparing his team for a championship final. Each man had a specific function. Every second was timed. He anticipated the routes, the police response times, the cartel's tactics. He wasn't planning a robbery. He was orchestrating a symphony of chaos and precision. His leadership was hypnotic, and his men, who once doubted the ex-player, now looked at him with almost religious reverence. They would follow El Capitan into hell. The execution was flawless. Using disguises from a public works company, they blocked the highway, forcing the convoy to a stop in a communications dead zone. The attack was fast, surgical, and overwhelming. It wasn't about brute force, but strategy. While one team created a noisy diversion miles away, Diego's main team neutralized the guards with gas and signal jamming technology. In less than 10 minutes, they vanished with a fortune that would take the Sinaloa cartel months to recover. The message had been sent. El Capitan wasn't just a problem. He was an existential crisis for the cartel. The Mexican underworld was shaken to its foundations. News of the heist spread like wildfire, and the name El Capitan began to be uttered with a new dose of terror and admiration. He had publicly humiliated the country's most powerful cartel, an act that put him at the top of the most wanted list for both the law and his enemies. Ricardo Vargas, from his position of power, felt a pang of concern for the first time. The crippled player he had dismissed as an insect had now become a formidable predator, and Vargas knew that the hunt now was personal. The war was no longer for territory, it was for survival. But success, as always, was a poison. Within Diego's own organization, the seed of betrayal began to sprout. One of his oldest lieutenants, a man named Hector, who had been with him from the beginning, started to feel the weight of envy. He saw Diego as an outsider who had stolen the glory that should have been his. Believing that El Capitan had gone too far and that the war against Sinaloa was suicide, Hector began to conspire, making contact with the remnants of El Martillo's crew, promising them Diego's head in exchange for power. El Silencio's loyalty, however, was unshakable. His eyes and ears were everywhere. He sensed the change in Hector's behavior, the dissonance in his words. With his own network of informants, he soon uncovered the conspiracy. Without fanfare, he approached Diego, not with accusations, but with irrefutable proof, a recording, a testimony. He presented the facts with the same coldness with which he would present a weapon, leaving the final decision in his Capitan's hands. The organization faced its first major internal test, and how Diego handled it would define his reign. The confrontation with Hector wasn't in a dark alley, but in Diego's luxurious penthouse with the city sparkling in the background. Hector, when confronted, tried to deny it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Diego didn't shout. His voice was calm, almost professorial. He walked slowly around Hector, explaining the principles of loyalty and the consequences of betrayal, not like a cartel boss, but like a coach explaining a serious foul to a player. On this team, betrayal doesn't send you to the bench, Hector. It takes you out of the game, permanently. Then he simply nodded to El Silencio, who carried out the sentence right there. Diego's coldness was the final message. He had become the monster he needed to be to rule that hell. After months of a relentless hunt that put him at the top of the Sinaloa cartel's enemy list, Diego finally found the opening he needed. Using a complex web of blackmail and espionage, he forced Ricardo Vargas's hand, cornering him into an unavoidable meeting. The chosen location was an act of pure psychological torture, a luxury box, empty and silent, in the very stadium where his life had been torn in half. The air was heavy with the ghosts of glory and pain. Outside, the field was dark and empty, a graveyard of dreams, while inside, Diego, now El Capitan, awaited the phantom that haunted him, ready for the final reckoning that would define his existence. Ricardo Vargas arrived with the arrogance of a man who believes himself untouchable, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He showed no fear, only the boredom of a powerful man being bothered by a persistent problem. However, his calm dissipated when El Silencio and Diego's other men emerged from the shadows, disarming his guards with brutal, silent efficiency. In seconds, the power dynamic shifted. Vargas was alone, face to face with the man whose life he had crushed. Diego said nothing. His eyes, cold as steel, spoke for him, conveying years of contained hatred, a promise of pain that would finally be delivered in this desecrated sanctuary of his past. "You know why you're here?" Diego's voice was a low growl, the first thing he said. Vargas, composing himself, forced a charming smile. "I imagine it's about that unfortunate accident. A shame. You had talent," he said, his tone condescending. It was this lack of remorse that broke Diego's thin layer of control. He grabbed him by the collar, his face inches from Vargas's, and spat out all his pain, the leg, the family, Isabella, the soul he lost. In response, Vargas laughed. "It was nothing personal, kid. It was just business. Your father owed, and your career was the only asset he had. It was a purely financial decision, and I must admit, a rather effective one." The confession, delivered with the coldness of an accountant closing a ledger, was more devastating than any physical assault. The monster wasn't a demon driven by hatred, but a bureaucrat of evil, for whom lives were just numbers on a spreadsheet. In that instant, Diego drew his gun and pressed it to Vargas's forehead. The click of the hammer echoed in the silence of the box. This was the moment, the climax of his descent into hell. Every life he took, every relationship he destroyed, every piece of his humanity he sacrificed had led him here, a trigger pull away from completing his revenge. The smell of fear finally emanated from Vargas, and Diego reveled in it. But as he looked into his tormentor's terrified eyes, Diego didn't feel the triumph he expected. He saw a pathetic, weak man whose only weapons were money and influence. Killing him now seemed too easy, an anticlimactic end to his opera of pain. Vengeance, which had been the black sun around which his new life orbited, suddenly felt hollow. He realized the bitter truth. Pulling the trigger wouldn't bring back the sound of the crowd chanting his name. It wouldn't bring back Isabella. It wouldn't wash the blood from his hands. Killing Vargas wouldn't redeem him. It would only make him a perfect reflection of the monster he so hated. In a moment of dizzying clarity, he understood that the real prison wasn't the wheelchair he almost occupied, but the throne of power he had built. At the exact instant of his epiphany, his radio crackled, the panicked voice of one of his lieutenants breaking the spell. It was a slaughter. The absence of El Capitan and his chief enforcer, El Silencio, was the opportunity their enemies had been waiting for. The Sinaloa Cartel, in alliance with men loyal to El Martillo and armed with precise information on the locations of his operational centers, had launched a massive coordinated assault. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. His labs were in flames, his warehouses were being looted, his men were being massacred in the streets. While he stood there paralyzed by his personal revenge, his empire was being reduced to ashes. A new, crueler. Choice presented itself, the past or the present, the revenge that created him or the kingdom he had built. Vargas, seeing the hesitation and hearing the echoes from the radio, began to smile again, sensing the tide turning in his favor. But the smile died when he saw the decision in Diego's eyes. It wasn't redemption, it was calculation. Diego slowly lowered the gun. He leaned in and whispered something in Vargas's ear, not a death threat, but the details of a fraudulent financial transaction that linked him directly to the Sinaloa cartel's enemies, a slower, more painful death sentence than a bullet. And then, without looking back, he turned, leaving the ghost of his past behind to try to save the monstrous future he had chosen. Diego returned to a battlefield. The coordinated attack by his enemies had left deep scars on his organization. He found his operational sites in ruins, the smell of smoke and death hanging in the air. Many of his most loyal men, those who saw him as a true leader, lay dead. He managed, with his tactical genius, to save a core of his power, repelling the attack and ensuring his survival. But it was a victory that tasted of ashes. The revenge against Vargas, the goal that had driven him for so long, now seemed like a futile distraction that had cost the lives of those who trusted him. He had spared his tormentor's life, but in the process, he had sacrificed the army that made him a king. Ricardo Vargas's fate was exactly as Diego had planned. The information he whispered in his ear spread like cancer within the Sinaloa cartel, revealing their financier's betrayal. Stripped of his protection and his fortune, Vargas disappeared from the circles of power, swallowed by the same shadows he once commanded. Diego had won. He became the dominant force in his territory, a feared and respected name. However, his crown was made of thorns. Now he was the primary target not only of the vengeful Sinaloa cartel, but also of Detective Morales, whose investigation was dangerously close to connecting him to his past as a player. His throne was, in fact, a solitary and guarded prison cell. The most devastating loss, however, was not material. The news of his deeds reached his family, who publicly disowned him. His father, sunk in a guilt-ridden depression, refused to touch the money Diego sent, seeing it as stained with blood. His mother, once his biggest fan, now lit candles not for his success, but for her son's lost soul. Even Chico, seeing Diego's face plastered on the news as a drug lord, felt only a profound sorrow for the friend who was gone forever. Diego reached the pinnacle of power, becoming more untouchable than he ever was on the field, but the price was absolute isolation. He was a king without a people, a son without a family, a man with no one to share the weight of his crown. Months later, the final image of Diego Ávila is that of a statue in a mausoleum. He is alone in his impenetrable fortress, the luxury around him only serving to amplify the emptiness. On a cinema-sized screen that takes up an entire wall, the recording of his last game plays on a silent loop. He watches the young Diego, vibrant and full of dreams, celebrate the goal, his eyes shining with hope. The face of El Capitan, who watches, however, is a mask of apathy. There is no pain, no joy, only the heavy silence of someone who lost everything to gain the world. He became the owner of the game, but he now realizes too late that the final prize is eternal loneliness in an empire built on the ashes of his own soul. Diego Ávila's journey is a dark echo about the price of revenge. It shows how ambition, when fueled by hatred, can lead us down a path where victory and defeat become indistinguishable. He traded the applause of thousands for the fearful silence of a few, and in the end, the glory he so desperately sought in the underworld was revealed to be just a pale shadow of the one he once had and lost on the field. Stories like his are a mirror of our own internal battles, of the monsters we all risk becoming. It is so that accounts like this are not lost that I ask for your support. Subscribing to the channel is the strength that allows me to continue giving a voice to these complex and deeply human journeys.